Much of the second half of the 20th century was dominated by the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West. It was a time of unprecedented military buildup and technological innovation, particularly in the area of aircraft. However, despite the effort and expense that were thrown at the problem, sometimes the results were less than excellent. On this video, we'll look at the 10 worst jet fighter planes of the Cold War, in our opinion. Your opinion may differ, which is one of the best things about lists like this one. Ordinarily here at the Uncover Up, we examine conspiracy content. However, anything Cold War related is always going to be only a few steps away from a conspiracy, and while on this video we'll concentrate on the aircraft themselves, we'll also briefly be discussing the CIA and UFOs, so we're not experiencing any mission creep here in the Uncover Up bunker. Here are the parameters we used to put together this list. The plane had to have been put into service between 1947 and 1991. It had to have been designed as a fighter, either as an interceptor tasked with quickly destroying incoming enemy bombers, or as an air superiority dogfighter tasked with controlling the airspace above the battle. In making this list, we've considered safety record, combat record, in those cases where the plane saw combat anyway, performance, and the historical context in which the fighter emerged. It wouldn't make much sense to compare a de Havilland Vampire from the early 50s with an F-16 from the late 70s, so we'll be looking at each plane placed amongst its historical contemporaries. Let's get right to it. We'll be starting with the least worst and going down the ladder until we arrive at the worst. And the least worst comes to us from the U.S. Navy of the 1950s and has the distinctions of becoming obsolete almost from the moment it was first built, and of being the first jet fighter to shoot itself down, the Grumman F11 Tiger. Now, Grumman was probably the name in American naval warplanes during World War II. They had produced thick plays like the Wildcat and the Hellcat, and would eventually go on to make the real star of Top Gun, the F-14 Tomcat. But the Tiger was a bit of a miss for Grumman, not a catastrophe. There were issues with the J-65 engine, although that was true of pretty much every first and second generation jet fighter, and it was the first fighter the U.S. Navy had that was capable of supersonic flight, although it couldn't achieve those speeds well fitted for operational service. And it was a bit of a looker, too. But because of range limitations, which is a real issue with a carrier-based plane, which tends to be surrounded by thousands of square miles of ocean hungry for crashed aircraft, and the fact that almost immediately after it made it to operational service, it was eclipsed by other much more capable and powerful carrier planes like the F-8 Crusader, the F-4 Phantom II, it got late early for the Tiger. It never saw combat, partly due to its very short service history, but the Tiger did manage to shoot down another plane, and one Tiger was shot down by a plane. Interestingly, there was only one Tiger and no other aircraft involved in both of those incidents. Because during a Tiger test flight in 1956, pilot Tom Attridge went into a supersonic dive and fired his cannons. His plane then caught up to his own bullets since he was still under power and the bullets were slowing down due to air resistance. Some of the bullets cracked his canopy and others damaged the engine. Attridge was forced to eject but fortunately survived with some broken bones, so technically the air-to-air win-loss combat ratio for the Tiger is 1-to-1. The McDonnell F-3H Demon could probably have also made it into this slot. It also had range and reliability issues, and it had a worse safety record than the Tiger did. But the difference is the F-3H paved the way for the F-4, and so still served a useful purpose, whereas the Tiger was something of a short-lived evolutionary dead end. Of course, there was a lot of that going on with second-generation jet fighters. The Soviets had their own issues to deal with in the 1950s. For example, the Americans were clearly flying some sort of mysterious spy planes over Soviet territory, and the Soviets needed something to shoot them down. What the Soviets had comes in at number 9 in our countdown, appropriately enough the Sukhoi SU-9, hilariously codenamed Fishpot by NATO. As you would expect, the Su-9, being a jet fighter from the 1950s, had some handling issues and some reliability issues. Apparently one Soviet pilot claimed that flying the Su-9 is like cuddling a tiger. It feels good, but it is dangerous and the outcome is uncertain. To be honest, that quotation just raises more questions than it answers. But despite how tricky it was to fly, it was apparently an excellent pilotless aircraft. At least 2 times, Su-9 pilots lost control and bailed out only to have the abandoned plane land safely on its own. But the main issue with the Su-9 is conceptual. The Soviet Air Force was big on structure and central command, and less keen on individual actions and choices. To a large degree, Soviet pilots were meant to follow the direct instructions of ground control and to not make decisions on their own. The Su-9 was an interceptor, which means it was meant to get to the target as soon as possible and eliminate it. For this purpose, rather than cannons, which are more of a dogfighting weapon, it was given beam-riding missiles. The plan was the Su-9 pilot would be guided to the target by ground control, fire off his missiles, and return to base for some borscht and vodka. However, beam-riding missiles do just what it says in the box. They travel along a radar or laser beam that the pilot of the interceptor needs to keep trained on the target. Like communism itself, this is fine in theory, but in practice it's very hard to keep your beam trained on a target that is understandably taking evasive maneuvers in order to avoid being shot down. In other words, the beam-riding missiles on the Su-9 needed not only the skill of the pilot of the Su-9, but also probably the cooperation of the target pilot as well in order to be successful. And needless to say, this was unlikely. This wasn't just an engineering failure of a specific platform, but instead the Su-9 is sort of an illustration of a systemic problem within the Soviet air defense structure. Now, the most famous incident involving an Su-9 was in 1960, when an unarmed Su-9 pilot was ordered to intercept and ram Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane. The Soviet pilot missed, but would later claim that the jet wash from his engine caused Powers' U-2 to disintegrate and crash, although the official and more likely version states that the U-2 was brought down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. When a plane's biggest claim to fame is that it failed at a ramming attempt, that plane has earned its spot on this list. Sticking with 1950s interceptors, we turn to the F-89 Scorpion, despite the fact that turning was one of the Scorpion's weak points. A large, lumbering beast of a plane, the early Scorpions were beset with structure problems in the tail and wings, as well as engine issues, obviously. But the best way to understand the issues with the F-89 that earned its spot is to look at the Battle of Palmdale. In August of 1956, a target drone, a surplus World War II Hellcat that had been rigged up with remote controls so it could be flown from the ground, lost contact with its controller during a flight and started heading towards Los Angeles. Now, fortunately, there was a nearby Air Force base with F-89 stationed at it, and so a couple of them were immediately scrambled and sent to intercept the Hellcat drone. Now, the Scorpions were able to catch up with the old propeller plane, which was flying slow and lazy and making no indications that it had become sentient and was trying to protect itself. The F-89 at the time was armed with 2 pods of 52 Mighty Mouse rockets each. These were unguided rockets, so the idea was, as someone once said, quantity has a quality of its own. You would fire off dozens and dozens of rockets at a target, and at least a couple would hopefully hit something and do something. Now, the F-89s also had a fancy new electronic system that would hand control over the firing of the rockets to an early sort of computer that would calculate the optimal firing moment based on the positions of the interceptor and the target. The 2 Scorpion pilots waited until the coast was reasonably clear, then tried to engage the Hellcat drone. However, the computer failed and wouldn't fire the rockets. Now, fortunately, the pilots could switch off the automatic firing mechanism. Unfortunately, when the automatic firing mechanism was installed in the planes, the manual gun sights were removed. Because again, why would you need to bother with manual gun sights when you had a flawless automatic computer firing system? The pilots just sort of had to aim their planes in the general direction of the Hellcat drone and then fire off over 200 rockets. It would take firefighters 2 days to put out all the brush fires caused by the over 200 rockets after they all missed the Hellcat and went crashing to the ground. A piece of one of the rockets burst into a woman's front window, bounced around her house, and ended up in her kitchen cabinet. After it became clear that the Mighty Mouse rocket system was badly flawed, the hundreds of tiny rockets were replaced with 2 unguided rockets with nuclear warheads. That's what we call in the business doubling down. Also, it's worth mentioning, even if it didn't figure into the evaluation, that in 1953 an F-89 was sent to intercept a UFO over Lake Superior and disappeared along with his 2 crew members. We have an entire podcast episode about it. And speaking of loss and death, The de Havilland Sea Vixen was designed as an interceptor for the RAF, the Royal Air Force, in the early 1950s. It was a strange-looking plane with a twin-boom configuration similar to its predecessors, the Vampire and the Venom. And even more strangely, the Sea Vixen had the pilot's cockpit off to one side, like the eyes of a flounder, and we'll come back to that in a second. In 1952, a Sea Vixen prototype was being shown off at the Farnborough Air Show. As it pulled up from a high-speed dive, the plane disintegrated in midair. The crew were both killed, as were 29 people watching from the ground below. The breakup was caused by a lack of structural integrity in the wings. The engineers just weren't prepared for the increased G-forces that would operate on supersonic aircraft. And the tragedy resulted in a change to airshow safety regulations and increased attention paid to wing stress in British jet fighters. Despite this, the Sea Vixen was put into production and adopted by the Royal Navy in 1959. The safety record didn't improve much, unfortunately. Of 145 Sea Vixens produced, 55 were destroyed in accidents, which caused the deaths of 51 crew members. Even by 1960s standards, that is a terrible loss rate, almost certainly made worse by the odd layout of the cockpit. While the pilot looked out from his canopy on the left half of the fuselage, the radar operator was sort of buried in the right half of the fuselage. This was so it would be dark enough in his cockpit area for him to make out the dim light of the radar screen. It also meant that he couldn't really see where the pilot was flying. And the degree of air sickness those radar operators must have had to fight through would have been apocalyptic. And also, not surprisingly, more radar operators and pilots were killed in Sea Vixen crashes. Now, in addition to the poor safety record and difficult operating conditions, the Sea Vixen also falls into the category of obsolete before introduction. The F-4 Phantom II had already had its first flight before the Sea Vixen entered service, and the Phantom was over twice as fast, carried more payload, was much more versatile, flew higher, and let the radar operator see where they were going. The Sea Vixen was another member of that cohort of designs that overpromised the reliability and effectiveness of early generations of air-to-air missiles, and so didn't have a built-in cannon, which is a common mistake that American fighter designers would be scrambling to correct after the Vietnam War began. At number 6, we have yet another interceptor. And there is a reason why interceptors have been featured prominently on this list so far. And it's because so many of the worst designs were second or third generation fighters, and those generations were largely dominated by the doctrine that the primary role of fighter aircraft was going to be to shoot down approaching bombers rather than maintaining control over contested airspace. This was wrong for a few reasons. One was that the utility of the nuclear bomber was quickly eclipsed by cruise missiles and ICBMs, which couldn't be intercepted by fighter aircraft anyway. The other reason was that in a non-nuclear conflict, air superiority was crucial and difficult to achieve with fast planes with short endurance and little dogfighting ability. The F-102 is an example both of a plane ill-conceived and poorly executed. An attractive delta-wing single-seater, the F-102 Dagger was developed in the middle of an absolute panic about the massive fleet of bombers the Soviet Union had paraded about in the sky during a 1955 air show. The M4, NATO codename Bison, struck fear into the hearts of American military leadership. It appeared to be a jet bomber comparable to the American B-52, which meant that it would be able to fly into the heart of America and drop nuclear warheads on American cities. Of course, as it would turn out, the M4 had many, many serious flaws, including short range and limited payload. Also, it would turn out that the reason that so many M4s flew by in the official Soviet film of the air show was that the small amount of M4s that were actually there were doing circles. So the same bombers just kept flying past the camera over and over again. Now, the CIA knew this, since they had sent U-2 spy planes over the Soviet bomber airfields. However, there were influential people in the Air Force and associate military-industrial complex who had an interest in the bomber gap fear that the fraudulent film strip had caused. There was a lot of money in that fear. So the F-102 was supposed to go very fast in order to intercept the alleged fleets of M4s and other Soviet bombers before they flew over American cities. However, the F-102 as first designed wasn't even fast enough to get out of its own way. The body of the plane appeared sleek and streamlined, but there was an issue. The problem is, air is surprisingly thick, and the faster you go, the more it wants to stop you. A jet plane is a nice, narrow, pointy tube at first, but then the air gets to the wings, and the air starts tumbling into itself. The secret is to narrow the plane fuselage around the middle point of where the wings attach so that the air has more room to rush past. Once this was done, the newly waist-cinched F-102 was able to sneak past the sound barrier, although still only just. Now, of course, the F-102 did at least evolve into the F-106, which was a blisteringly fast interceptor that was extremely capable at doing a job that, in the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, didn't really make any sense anymore. But the F-106 was the perfect answer to a question that was no longer being asked. Now, the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter was the answer to the question that everyone was asking, just as so long as everyone was asking, hey, can we just stick a human being in a missile and fire it at the enemy? In the 1950s, pilots had come back from the Korean War asking for a plane that was faster, and Lockheed said, hold my beer. The F-104 was hilariously streamlined, basically just a bit of aluminum copper alloy stretched over an engine and a pilot with a few tiny wings bolted on the side. It did have some issues, though. One of the main issues wasn't the airplane's fault. It was just much, much faster than the plane's fighter pilots would have been used to. This led to a pretty steep learning curve, and it's dangerous to go around a steep curve at twice the speed of sound. Like a lot of planes from this era, the engine had issues cutting out or suddenly losing thrust. The wings didn't generate much lift, which meant the landing speed was extremely high. In fact, the wings were so tiny that the tail planes were only slightly smaller, and this caused some aerodynamic issues, which were solved by placing the tail planes very high up on the rudder. But what this meant was there was some concern that when a pilot ejected, and many F-104 pilots were going to have to eject, he would then get sliced in half by the high tail planes. The solution? A downward-firing ejection seat, which would shoot the pilot away from the dangerous rear tailplane. Unfortunately, it also meant that in a low-altitude ejection situation, the pilot would be rocketed right into the dangerous ground, and about a dozen F-104 pilots died in this fashion. The F-104 had a middling combat record, some with the United States Air Force in Vietnam, but mostly for other countries. When it was put into service, the U.S. Air Force was already moving towards large and complicated fighters. And so a tiny, simple fighter didn't really fit the bill. The American government cut their F-104 order from about 800 to 100, which was a big hit to Lockheed. Fortunately, the Starfighter became an extremely popular purchase for other NATO countries, including but not limited to Canada and Germany and Italy. Now, it would later turn out that this was in part because of an enormous bribery scandal. And when the bribery scandal combined with the brutal safety record of the F-104, 31% of German starfighters and 46% of Canadian starfighters were lost in accidents, claiming the lives of dozens of pilots, the F-104 understandably developed a bad rep in media as a widowmaker and as a poor procurement choice. But procurement, deciding which fighter planes your government should buy, it's a tricky thing to pull off successfully all the time. As the number 5 entry proves, this was a good-looking plane from an iconic manufacturer, and it was a complete dud. The Supermarine Swift did live up to its name by being one of the fastest second-generation jet fighters. Unfortunately, the name also applies to the swiftness with which it was developed and put into production. It was an example of a plane that was being left behind by progress as it was being designed, and the frantic attempts to modernize it just made it unstable and useless. The Supermarine firm was riding a high after their magnificent Spitfire had become a symbol of British pluck and innovation during World War II. And Supermarine wanted a piece of the post-war action too. The first attempt was the Supermarine Attacker, which looked like a typical first-gen fighter with the straight wings taken from a propeller plane and a tail that dragged on the ground. Like the rest of the first-gen jets, the Attacker was clearly a stopgap measure, while the RAF became accustomed to operating the new kind of engine. But when it came time to design the Swift, Supermarine just swept the Attacker's wings back and put a nose wheel on and called it a day. This meant that the balance, the airflow, the control surfaces of the Swift were never really properly integrated with the new wings, and this showed up in some dicey handling properties, including a tendency to suddenly go nose up and flip over backwards. Now, this was dealt with by putting heavy ballast in the nose, and since extra weight is the enemy of handling, range, and speed, this was not an ideal solution. There was also an issue, not uncommon with early jets, with the armament. When the cannons were fired, the exhaust from the guns could get sucked into the engine intakes and cause the engine to flame out. In service, the Swift had to operate with strict regulations regarding speed, altitude, and weapons firing. and after a few accidents, the Swift fleet was grounded, and by 1955 it was removed from service. Now, the Hawker Hunter, which came out at the same time to do the same job, had been built from the ground up as a second-generation swept-wing fighter plane. And while it also had its share of initial issues, because it had been designed properly from the ground up as a second-gen fighter, those issues were fixable. The Hunter went on to a successful and long career with the RAF and plenty of other air forces, while the Swift disappeared into scandal and then obscurity. The lesson is sometimes you need to go a little slower to go further. Or you can go entirely the other direction and build the weirdest, most radical plane imaginable. This is what the Vought Aircraft Corporation did with its F7 Cutlass. If Supermarine had borrowed too heavily from the past with the Swift, Vought gambled too wildly on the future with the Cutlass, and it comes in at number 3 on the list. The Cutlass looked like a 1950s version of a 1980s idea of what a spaceship would look like, if that makes sense. It was the U.S. Navy's first swept-wing fighter, its first tailless fighter, and its first fighter with afterburning engines. Looking ahead is a key aspect of fighter design. Anyone who builds a new fighter for the current moment will produce something obsolete, and this has happened many times. However, Vought built a fighter for a future that was never going to happen because the engine that the plane needed was never going to exist. The oddness of the plane actually derives from two desperate moments. The obvious moment is the Cold War, of course, a time in which any strange idea was on the table if it meant even the possibility of giving one side a leg up in the tech race. But there was an earlier moment of desperation that figured into the Cutlass's design. Since much of the tailless and swept wing research had come from German scientists brought over after World War II in Operation Paperclip, an American government program to benefit from the work of Nazis while whitewashing their past. These scientists have been given the funding and go-ahead to experiment with all sorts of unconventional designs as it became clearer and clearer that the German skies were filling with American P-51s and B-17s. And in the decades after the war ended, the American government was willing to set aside morality and justice to gain access to that research. But franticness rarely results in clarity, and there were many fatally flawed aspects to the Cutlass's design. The Westinghouse J-34 and later J-46 engines weren't powerful enough or reliable enough to make carrier landings safe. Not that carrier landings are ever totally safe, but it's vital to be able to summon full power as instantly as possible to fly back out of dicey landing situations. The Cutlass engines took a while to spool up, and those precious seconds were the difference between surviving to go around and try again and crashing into the deck. Every carrier landing is a borderline crash anyway, but the Cutlass's landing gear was not up to the task. The extraordinarily long nose gear would often collapse, sometimes up into the pilot's cockpit, which could cause injury or even accidental ejection seat firing. The hydraulic controls would often fail, and while there was a backup system, it would take 11 seconds to kick in. 11 seconds is an awfully long time to not have control over your jet airplane. And pilots knew the plane was a problem. Wally Schirra, a Cutlass pilot and future astronaut, called it an accident waiting to happen. A pilot named Tom Quillen took off on a routine flight along with 3 other Cutlasses and immediately had a problem and had to return. To his dismay, he found that he was already 3rd in line for an emergency landing after 2 of the other Cutlasses he took off with. It killed a lot of test pilots and Navy pilots and had the worst accident rate of any Navy swept-wing fighter. The future came to an end in 1959 when the surviving Cutlasses were removed from service. One of the good things you can say about the Cutlass is that at least it wasn't in service long enough to go into combat. The same can't be said of the number 2 plane on our list, the MiG-23, NATO codenamed Flogger. MiG was maybe the Cold War Soviet fighter manufacturer. They had shocked the West with the MiG-15, then continued to challenge the large, expensive American fighter planes with the simple little 17 and 19. The MiG-21 terrified the West with its brutalist effectiveness and performance. And then they produced the 23. Now, the 23 was clearly of its time. In the 1960s, fighter design was moving towards large, complicated, powerful missile platforms rather than agile dogfighters, and speed was life. The problem with speed is that it requires a slippery shape, and those slippery shapes often have terrible low-speed handling characteristics and terrifying landing speeds. Many manufacturers at the time, including Grumman, Panavia, Sukhoi, Rockwell, Tupolev, General Dynamics, they decided that the answer to this problem was the variable geometry wing. a wing that could extend out for slow-speed maneuverability and then sweep back for high-speed bursts. And at first it seems to be the perfect solution. However, the mechanism necessary to move the wings forward and backwards makes a plane considerably heavier, more expensive, and more complex. Weight and complexity mean more wear and tear on components, which requires more maintenance. And since the MiG-23 was sold to other countries who had limited resources to maintain jet fighters, that meant that the countries that purchased the 23 had to deal with reduced readiness rates and poorly aging airframes, both of which, of course, resulted in higher accident rates. In addition, the Soviet government was hesitant about letting all of their jet fighter technology out of their own hands, and so built special versions of the 23 specifically for export. These versions had less capable radar, fewer weapon options, and completely lacked electronic countermeasures to help evade missiles. Now, all of this in a hot rod airframe that was designed to fight with missiles from a distance rather than get into close dogfights. The result of the degraded capability and maintenance was that the export countries had to deal with what was a truly terrible air-to-air win-loss record. For every MiG-23 that shot down an enemy plane, 4 MiG-23s were shot down by enemy planes. The cheaper and simpler MiG-21, used under many of the same maintenance and training conditions as the 23, had a much better record, shooting down 1 plane for every 2 MiG-21s shot down. The MiG-25 had a 1-to-1 shoot-down record. The MiG-23 was sold all over the world and succeeded nowhere, and yet was still much, much better than the number 1 aircraft on our list. The Cold War lasted as long as it did without erupting into nuclear Armageddon, in part because there was a balance of destructive capability between the two sides. One side built jet bombers, the other side built jet bombers. One side developed ICBMs, the other side developed ICBMs. The CIA believed that the Soviets were weaponizing psychics, so the Americans tried to weaponize psychics, and so on. But one area in which the Americans consistently had a significant advantage was in naval power. And because the Cold War encompassed the entire globe, and because nuclear missile subs were one of the most secure methods of ensuring that you could always strike back, even if your country was a smoking radioactive ruin, naval power was crucial. By World War II, the brief age of the battleship had ended, and the new flagship was the aircraft carrier. The Americans had many of them, the Soviets had none. The Kiev-class Soviet aircraft carriers were built in the 1970s, but the Soviets had no specialized naval fighter planes. And at the time, the British were the talk of the aircraft world, having developed the Harrier jump jet, which was capable of vertical takeoff and landing, as well as dogfighting, carrying out ground attack missions, and carrying a wide variety of useful weapons payloads. The Soviets decided they were going to create their own jump jet, and that was the Yak-38. And right from jump, things went sideways. The Harrier had a single engine and vectored thrust. The engine could point downwards to allow vertical flight, or backwards for conventional flight. It was an elegant system. It wasn't without its compromises. The Harrier had limited range, wasn't capable of supersonic flight, but it was still an effective weapon system. Now, the Yak-38, on the other hand, used a redundant and clumsy method to achieve the same goal. The 38 had 3 engines, 1 for conventional forward flight and 2 for vertical flight. But this meant that when it was flying like a normal jet, it was carrying the weight of 2 useless engines. And when it was taking off or landing, it had to do so with another heavy engine sitting in the fuselage like an anchor. As a result, the Yak-38 was shockingly incapable as a weapon system. It was so crammed full of engines that before any mission, a decision would have to be made whether to load up on fuel or weapons, because having both would make the plane too heavy to fly. On a hot day, the 38 had about 15 minutes of endurance. Exhaust gases would often get sucked back into the engine intakes, causing power loss. It had no radar to detect enemy planes. It only had about 115 miles of combat range. If one of the 2 vertical lift engines failed, as they often did, the Yak-38 would immediately become unflyable and would crash. As a safety feature, if the plane detected an abrupt change in pitch, it would trigger the pilot's ejection seat and hurtle him away from the doomed plane. Unfortunately, this system was apparently a little touchy and overreacted a few times. Once this happened in front of a Royal Navy warship. The pilot was rescued by the British ship, fortunately, but it was an extremely expensive embarrassment. By the time the Yak-38 had been retired in 1991, about a third of them were lost in accidents. It never saw any air-to-air combat, but it could hardly have been any more dangerous to its pilots than it was when it was just trying to fly around. There are all sorts of ways to fail. Some of these planes were too ambitious or not ambitious enough. Some were victims of doctrines in which reality didn't match up with what the galaxy brains in charge of the war effort were thinking. The Cold War was a time of paranoia, terror, fear, disinformation, and the constant pressure to at least match the enemy move for move and preferably get a few moves ahead. In an environment such as that one, it's no surprise that mistakes were made. The tragedy of those mistakes is seen in the massive amount of money that was thrown at flawed airplanes and in the human cost carved into tombstones on both sides of the conflict.